The scream tore through the afternoon air like a wounded animal, and Franklin Pierce knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. He had been riding his chestnut mare along the dusty trail between Montrose and Ouray, Colorado, enjoying the September sunshine of 1883, when he heard it. His eyes scanned the scrubland ahead, and that was when he saw the wagon tilted at an odd angle off the road, one wheel clearly broken, and a woman doubled over beside it. Franklin urged his horse forward, his heart pounding harder with each stride. As he drew closer, he could see she was young, maybe 22 or 23, with dark blonde hair coming loose from its pins and a face contorted in pain. Her dress was soaked with sweat despite the mild temperature, and when she looked up at him with wild green eyes, he saw terror mixed with relief. "Please," she gasped. "Help me. The baby is coming now." Franklin dismounted so fast he nearly stumbled, his boots kicking up dust as he rushed to her side. He was only 25 himself, a ranch hand who had seen plenty of calves and foals born but never a human child. His hands shook as he reached for her arm to steady her. "When did the pain start?" he asked, forcing his voice to remain calm even though his mind was racing. "Hours ago," she said, gritting her teeth through another contraction. "I was trying to get to Montrose. My husband, he died 3 months back. Fever took him. I have been staying with my sister in Ouray, but I wanted to get back to our homestead before the baby came. I thought I had time. I thought I had days, maybe a week." Her water had broken. He could see that much from the wet fabric clinging to her legs. Franklin had no idea what to do, but he knew she could not stay out here in the open with night approaching and the nearest doctor still hours away in Montrose. Even if he rode hard, he would never make it there and back before this baby arrived. "What is your name?" he asked, helping her lean against the side of the wagon. "Grace," she panted. "Grace Crawford." "All right, Grace. I am Franklin Pierce, and I am going to help you through this. We are going to do this together." She let out a bitter laugh that turned into a cry of pain. "You are a cowboy, not a midwife." "No, but I have brought plenty of animals into this world, and the basics cannot be that different. Your body knows what to do. We just need to make you as comfortable as possible and let nature take its course." Grace looked at him with a mixture of desperation and gratitude. She had no other choice, and they both knew it. Franklin quickly assessed their situation. The wagon was useless with its broken wheel, but it provided some shelter. He could see supplies in the back, blankets and such. His mind worked through the logistics even as another scream tore from her throat. "How far apart are the pains?" he asked. "Close," she gasped. "So close. Maybe a few minutes." Franklin cursed under his breath and started moving with purpose. He grabbed his bedroll from his saddle and spread it on the ground in the shade of the wagon. Then he climbed into the wagon bed and found her belongings, pulling out every clean blanket and sheet he could find. His hands worked quickly, efficiently, the way they did when he was mending a fence or breaking a horse. This was just another crisis to manage, he told himself, even though his heart hammered against his ribs like a wild thing. "Can you walk a few steps?" he asked, returning to her side. Grace nodded, her face pale but determined. He put his arm around her waist, supporting most of her weight as they slowly made their way to the makeshift bed he had prepared. She lowered herself down with a groan, and Franklin knelt beside her. "I need to check how far along you are," he said, his face flushing red. "I know this is not proper, but proper went out the window the moment my water broke in the middle of nowhere," Grace said with a strained smile. "Do what you need to do." Franklin had helped his mother once when a neighbor woman went into labor years ago, before he left home to work the ranches. He remembered enough to know what to look for. With trembling hands and eyes averted as much as possible, he lifted her skirts and checked. What he saw made his stomach drop. "The baby is coming very soon," he said, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. "I can see the head already." Grace let out a sound between a sob and a laugh. Of course it would be fast. Nothing about this has gone according to plan." Franklin grabbed his canteen and poured water over his hands, scrubbing them as best he could. He wished he had soap, wished he had a doctor, wished he had any idea what he was truly doing. But wishing would not help Grace or her baby, so he pushed his fear aside and focused on what needed to be done. "Listen to me," he said, looking directly into her eyes. "When the next pain comes, I need you to push. Push as hard as you can. Your body will tell you what to do. I am right here and I am not going anywhere." Grace nodded, her breath coming in short gasps. Sweat poured down her face and Franklin grabbed a cloth from her wagon, dampened it with water and wiped her forehead. She closed her eyes briefly, seeming to draw strength from that small comfort. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered. "You could have just ridden for the doctor and left me." "That is not the kind of man I am," Franklin said simply. "Besides, there is no time for that now. This baby is coming whether we are ready or not." Another contraction seized her and Grace screamed, bearing down with every ounce of strength she possessed. Franklin positioned himself to catch the baby, his heart in his throat. He could see more of the head now, dark hair matted and wet. "That is good," he encouraged. "You are doing so good, Grace. When the next one comes, push again." The September sun beat down on them despite the shade from the wagon, and Franklin could feel sweat dripping down his own back. His shirt stuck to his skin, and his hands were steady now, focused entirely on the task before him. Grace was incredible, he thought. Even in agony, even terrified and alone out here, she was fighting with everything she had. "I cannot do this," she sobbed between contractions. "It hurts too much. I cannot." "Yes, you can," Franklin said firmly. "You are the strongest woman I have ever met, Grace Crawford. You can do anything. This baby needs you, just a little more." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them in that moment. Trust, maybe, or recognition of some kind. Her hand shot out and grabbed his, squeezing so hard he thought his bones might break, but he did not pull away. "Okay," she breathed. "Okay, tell me when." The next contraction built like a wave, and Franklin could see her entire body tensing. "Now," he said. "Push now, Grace." She pushed, and the baby's head emerged fully into Franklin's waiting hands. His breath caught in his throat at the miracle of it, this tiny perfect head with a scrunched-up face. He had delivered foals and calves, but this was different. This was a human child, Grace's child, and he held the small life in his work-roughened hands with a reverence he had never felt before. "The head is out," he told her, his voice thick with emotion. "One more big push and your baby will be here." Grace was crying now, tears streaming down her face mixing with the sweat. "Is the baby all right? Tell me the baby is all right." "The baby is perfect," Franklin said, and he meant it. "One more, Grace. You can do this." She gathered herself, every muscle in her body straining, and pushed with a sound that came from somewhere deep and primal. The baby slipped out into Franklin's hands in a rush of fluid and blood, and for a terrifying moment, the child was silent. Franklin's medical knowledge was limited, but he remembered his mother slapping the bottom of the baby she had delivered. He turned the infant over gently and gave a light tap. The baby let out a wail that was the most beautiful sound Franklin had ever heard. Relief flooded through him so powerfully that he nearly wept himself. "It is a boy," he said, laughing through the emotion clogging his throat. "Grace, you have a son." He quickly wiped the baby's face and mouth with a clean cloth, clearing away mucus and fluid. The cord still connected mother and child, pulsing with life. Franklin had seen enough animal births to know it needed to be cut, but he also knew to wait a few minutes. He wrapped the baby in one of Grace's clean blankets and placed him on her chest. Grace's arms came around her son instinctively, and she sobbed with joy and exhaustion. "My boy," she whispered. "My beautiful boy." Franklin sat back on his heels, his whole body trembling now that the immediate crisis had passed. He watched Grace with her newborn son, watched the baby root against her breast seeking food, watched the pure love radiating from her face, and felt something shift inside his chest. This woman, this stranger, had trusted him completely in her most vulnerable moment. She had put her life and her child's life in his hands, and somehow, miraculously, everything had turned out all right, but they were not done yet. Franklin knew there was still the afterbirth to deliver, and Grace needed real medical attention to make sure there were no complications. He also needed to cut the cord. He pulled his knife from his belt and held the blade over the flame of a match to sterilize it as best he could. "I need to cut the cord," he told Grace gently. "It might feel strange, but it will not hurt you or the baby." She nodded, too absorbed in her son to pay much attention. Franklin tied off the cord in 2 places with clean strips of fabric torn from one of Grace's petticoats, then cut between the ties. The baby did not even flinch, nursing contentedly now. About 20 minutes later, the afterbirth came, and Franklin wrapped it in cloth and set it aside. He helped Grace clean up as modestly as possible, giving her fresh cloths and helping her into a clean dress from her trunk. His face stayed red the entire time, but he moved with efficiency and care. Grace seemed beyond embarrassment now, focused entirely on her baby. "We need to get you to a doctor," Franklin said once she was settled more comfortably. "I can ride to Montrose and bring one back, or I can rig up some kind of travois to pull behind my horse and get you there myself." "How far is it?" Grace asked, her voice tired. "About 15 miles to Montrose. 3 or 4 hours on horseback, longer with a travois." Grace looked down at her son, then back at Franklin. "I do not want you to leave us alone out here. What if something goes wrong? What if there are complications?" Franklin understood her fear. They were in the middle of nowhere, the land stretching out empty and brown around them. Any number of dangers could appear, from wild animals to bandits to simple medical emergencies neither of them could handle. "All right," he decided. "I will make a travois. It will be rough going, but we will make it." He worked quickly, using materials from Grace's broken wagon and rope from his saddle. He created a sturdy frame that could be dragged behind his horse, cushioned with blankets and her feather mattress from the wagon. It was not comfortable, but it would serve. As he worked, Grace watched him with her son in her arms. "Why were you out here alone?" she asked. "Where were you heading?" "Just riding between jobs," Franklin said, lashing poles together. "I finished up at a ranch outside our array and was heading back to Montrose where my family has some land. Nothing special." "You saved our lives," Grace said softly. "That seems pretty special to me." Franklin paused in his work and looked at her. Really looked at her. Even exhausted and disheveled from giving birth, she was beautiful, but it was more than that. There was a strength in her, a resilience that drew him. She had been widowed, pregnant, and alone, trying to make it to her homestead by herself. She had faced the terror of labor without a doctor or midwife. And now she gazed at him with gratitude and something else he could not quite name. "Anyone would have done the same," he said, but they both knew that was not true. Plenty of men would have ridden for help and left her. Some might not have stopped at all. "What was your husband like?" Franklin asked as he worked. He was not sure why he needed to know, but the question rose in him unbidden. Grace's face softened with sadness. "Good. Kind. Thomas was a good man. We only had 1 year together before the fever took him. He was a carpenter, had dreams of building us a real house on the homestead." We were going to have a family, raise our children in Colorado where the air is clean and there is space to breathe. I am sorry for your loss, Franklin said, meaning it. So am I, Grace replied. But I have his son now. Thomas will live on through him. I am going to name him Thomas, after his father. Franklin nodded, understanding. He finished the travois and carefully helped Grace onto it, making sure she and baby Thomas were secure and as comfortable as possible. He loaded what he could from her wagon onto his horse and covered the rest with canvas, hoping he could return for it later or send someone to retrieve it. The journey to Montrose was slow and painful. Every bump in the trail made Grace wince, though she bit back her complaints. Franklin stopped frequently to check on her and the baby, to give her water, to adjust the blankets. The sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. As they traveled, they talked. Grace told him about growing up in Ohio, about meeting Thomas at a church social, about their dreams of a new life in the West. Franklin told her about working ranches since he was 16, about his parents' small farm outside Montrose, about his love for the open land and the animals he tended. "Do you want your own ranch someday?" Grace asked during one of their rest stops. "I do," Franklin admitted. "Been saving up for years. I have my eye on some land northwest of town. Good grazing, creek runs through it. Maybe in another year or two I will have enough to buy it and start building." "That sounds wonderful," Grace said wistfully. "Thomas and I had 160 acres from the Homestead Act. We proved it up, built a small cabin. It is not much, but it is ours. Mine, I mean." The correction hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Franklin wanted to say something, but he did not know what. Instead, he offered her more water and checked on little Thomas, who slept peacefully despite the jostling journey. Darkness had fallen by the time they finally reached Montrose. The town was small but growing, with a main street lined with businesses and houses spreading out from there. Franklin headed straight for Doc Morrison's house, the only physician within 50 miles. He pounded on the door, not caring that it was nearly 10 o'clock at night. Doc Morrison was a gray-haired man in his 60s who had seen just about everything in his 40 years of practicing medicine. He took one look at Grace and the baby and immediately ushered them inside, his wife appearing in a nightgown to help. Franklin stood awkwardly in the doorway until the doctor waved him in. "You delivered this baby?" Doc Morrison asked as he examined Grace with practiced efficiency. "Yes, sir, out on the trail. Her wagon broke down." The doctor grunted, checking mother and child thoroughly. After what felt like an eternity, he straightened up and nodded. "You did good work, son. Mother and baby are both healthy. She needs rest and good food, but she will be fine. The boy is a good size, breathing well, no signs of distress. You are lucky." Franklin felt his knees go weak with relief. "Thank God." "You can thank God all you want, but you should also thank yourself," Doc Morrison said. "Not many men could have kept their heads in that situation. Where is her family?" "I do not have anyone." Grace spoke up from the bed where Mrs. Morrison had settled her. "Just my sister in our array, but we had a falling out. She did not approve of me wanting to return to the homestead." "You cannot go back to a homestead alone with a newborn," the doctor said firmly. "Not for at least a few weeks. You need to recover." "I will pay for a room at the boarding house," Franklin heard himself say, "until she is strong enough to decide what to do." Everyone looked at him in surprise. He felt his face flush but stood his ground. "It is the right thing to do," he added, Grace's eyes filled with tears. "You have already done so much. I cannot ask you to. You are not asking. I am offering." Franklin met her gaze steadily. "You and Thomas need somewhere safe to stay. I have the money. Let me help." Doc Morrison looked between them with knowing eyes. "That is very generous of you, young man." Grace, I would recommend staying here tonight where my wife can keep an eye on you, then moving to the boarding house tomorrow. You will need at least 2 weeks of rest before you should even think about traveling. Grace nodded, wiping her eyes. Thank you, all of you. I do not know how to repay this kindness. Franklin stayed until Mrs. Morrison shooed him away, insisting that Grace needed rest. He paid the doctor's fee and went to the boarding house to arrange a room, paying for 2 weeks in advance. The proprietor, a stout woman named Mrs. Henderson, listened to the story with soft eyes and promised to make sure Grace had everything she needed. It was past midnight when Franklin finally made it to his parents' farm on the edge of town. His mother, Martha Pierce, took one look at him and pulled him into a hug despite the blood and dirt staining his clothes. "We heard someone delivered a baby on the trail," she said. "The whole town is talking. I should have known it was you." Franklin's father, Henry, gripped his shoulder with pride. "You did a good thing, son. A brave thing." That night, Franklin lay in his childhood bed and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Grace's face, heard her screams of pain, felt the weight of baby Thomas in his hands. Something had changed in him out there on that trail, something fundamental and irreversible. The next morning, he went to the boarding house before breakfast, carrying fresh milk from his parents' cow and eggs from their chickens. Mrs. Henderson let him in with a knowing smile and pointed him to Grace's room. He knocked softly, and Grace's tired voice called for him to enter. She was sitting up in bed, baby Thomas nursing at her breast. A blanket was draped over them for modesty, but Franklin could see the maternal contentment on her face. She looked up at him and smiled, and his heart did something complicated in his chest. "Good morning," she said. "I did not expect to see you so early." "I brought some things," Franklin said, holding up the basket. "Thought you might be hungry." "I am starving," Grace admitted with a laugh. "But first, come meet your godson properly." Franklin approached slowly and looked down at the baby. In the morning light streaming through the window, he could see Thomas clearly. The baby had dark hair like his mother and a sweet face. He was perfect. "He is beautiful," Franklin said honestly. "He is alive because of you," Grace said, her voice thick. "We both are. I have been lying here all night thinking about what would have happened if you had not come along. We would have died out there." "But I did come along," Franklin said, "and you are both fine. That is what matters." Over the next 2 weeks, Franklin visited Grace every day. He brought food, helped carry water, and ran errands. He held baby Thomas while Grace bathed or ate, marveling at how something so tiny could be so complete. He told himself he was just being helpful, just doing the Christian thing. But his heart knew the truth. He was falling in love with Grace Crawford. It happened gradually and then all at once. It was in the way she laughed at his stories about ornery cattle. It was in the strength she showed as she recovered, never complaining about the pain. It was in the gentle way she tended her son, the fierce love in her eyes. It was in the conversations that stretched for hours, ranging from silly to serious to somewhere in between. Grace felt it too. She could see it in the way Franklin looked at her, in the careful tenderness with which he held Thomas, in the fact that he showed up every single day without fail. She had loved Thomas Crawford with all her heart, and part of her felt guilty for feeling this way so soon. But another part of her recognized that her late husband would want her to be happy, would want their son to have a father. On the 15th day, Doc Morrison declared Grace well enough to travel. She was standing by the window of her room at the boarding house, baby Thomas sleeping in a cradle. Mrs. Henderson had provided when Franklin arrived for his daily visit. "Doc Morrison says I am recovered," she said without preamble. "I suppose I should start making plans to get back to the homestead." Franklin's stomach dropped. He had known this day would come, but he was not ready for it. Are you sure that is what you want, to be out there alone with Thomas? What choice do I have? Grace asked, turning to face him. The homestead is all I have. If I abandon it, I lose everything my husband and I worked for. You could stay in Montrose, Franklin said. Find work here, raise Thomas in town. Doing what? I am a widow with a newborn. Who would hire me? Grace's voice was bitter. At least at the homestead, I have a roof over my head and land to farm. Franklin took a deep breath. He had been thinking about this constantly for 2 weeks, turning it over in his mind. Now seemed like the time to speak. You could stay because I am asking you to. Grace went very still. What are you saying, Franklin? I am saying that I have come to care for you these past weeks. You and Thomas both. I am saying that I think about you constantly, that I look forward to seeing you every day more than anything else. I am saying that I would like the chance to court you properly if you would let me. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Franklin, I am a widow. I have a baby. You are a young man with your whole life ahead of you. You could find someone without all this baggage. I do not want someone else, Franklin said firmly, crossing the room to stand in front of her. I want you, Grace. I want to help you raise Thomas. I want to build a life with you. I know it is fast, I know people will talk, but I do not care. Life is too short and too uncertain. I learned that out on that trail. When you know something is right, you should not waste time. What about the fact that I loved my husband? Grace asked, her voice breaking. Does that not bother you? No, Franklin said simply. It tells me that you know how to love deeply and truly. Thomas was a lucky man to have had you, even for a short time. I hope to be as lucky. Grace let out a sob and covered her face with her hands. Franklin waited, his heart pounding, barely breathing. When she finally looked up at him, her face was wet with tears, but her eyes were clear. I care for you too, she whispered. More than I thought possible so soon. You have been so good to me, so kind, but I am afraid. Afraid of losing someone I love again. Afraid of being a burden. Afraid that you will wake up one day and regret taking on a ready-made family. Franklin gently took her hands in his. I cannot promise that nothing bad will ever happen. Life does not work that way. But I can promise that I will be there through whatever comes. I can promise that I will love Thomas as if he were my own. And I can promise that I will spend every day trying to make you happy. That is all anyone can promise, Grace said, a shaky smile forming through her tears. When do you want to start courting? How about right now? Franklin asked, grinning. Let me take you for a walk. We can bring Thomas. They walked through Montrose in the late afternoon sunshine, baby Thomas bundled in Grace's arms. People stared and whispered, but neither of them cared. They talked about everything and nothing, making plans and sharing dreams. Franklin told her about the land he wanted to buy, and Grace told him about the improvements she had envisioned for the homestead. What if we combined resources? Franklin suggested as they sat on a bench in the small town park. Your homestead is proved up, legal and clear, and I have savings. We could build something real there together. You would want to live at my homestead? Grace asked in surprise. I would want to live wherever you are, Franklin said honestly. But yes, it makes sense. The land is yours. We could expand the cabin, build proper outbuildings, start a herd. In a few years, we could have a real working ranch. Grace looked down at Thomas, then back at Franklin. You really mean all of this, do not you? You are not just caught up in the drama of what happened. I have never been more certain of anything in my life, Franklin replied. They courted for 6 months, proper and respectable. Franklin called on Grace at the boarding house where she had taken a job helping Mrs. Henderson with cooking and cleaning to pay her way. He brought flowers and small gifts. He took her on picnics and to church socials. And he spent hours playing with Thomas, who grew bigger and more alert every day. The town gossips had plenty to say about the cowboy courting the widow, but most people were supportive. Doc Morrison and his wife became champions of the match, and Franklin's parents welcomed Grace and Thomas with open arms. Martha Pierce doted on the baby, thrilled at the prospect of a grandson. In March of 1884, Franklin Pierce and Grace Crawford were married in a simple ceremony at the Montrose Church. Grace wore a blue dress that brought out her eyes, and Franklin wore his best suit. Baby Thomas, now 6 months old, gurgled happily in Martha's arms during the vows. They moved to the homestead the day after the wedding. Franklin saw immediately that Grace and her late husband had chosen well. The land was good, the cabin was sturdy, and the location was protected from the worst of the winter winds. But it needed work, lots of it. Franklin threw himself into improvements with the joy of a man building his future. He expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and a room for Thomas. He built a barn and a chicken coop. He bought a small herd of cattle with his savings and began building the ranch he had always dreamed of. Grace worked alongside him, as strong and capable as any ranch wife he had ever known. She tended a garden, preserved food for winter, made cheese and butter. She sewed clothes and mended harnesses. And she took care of Thomas with a fierce love that made Franklin's heart swell every time he saw it. At night, they lay in bed exhausted from the day's work, and Franklin would hold Grace close. Sometimes they made love with quiet passion. Sometimes they just talked in the darkness, sharing thoughts and dreams. And sometimes they listened to Thomas breathing in his cradle nearby, marveling at the life they were building together. "Are you happy?" Franklin asked one night as they lay tangled together. "So happy it scares me sometimes," Grace admitted. "I never thought I would feel this way again after losing Thomas. I never thought I would want to." "I am glad you do," Franklin said, kissing her forehead. "I am glad you took a chance on me." "You took a chance on me first," Grace reminded him. "You stopped to help a stranger in trouble. You could have just ridden on by." "That was never an option," Franklin said. "From the moment I saw you, something in me knew." "Knew what?" Grace asked. "That you would change my life forever." The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and work. In the spring of 1885, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Florence. Franklin was with her this time, holding her hand through the labor, with Doc Morrison delivering the baby in their own bed. When he held his daughter for the first time, Franklin wept openly, overwhelmed by the miracle of it. Thomas grew into a sturdy little boy who followed Franklin everywhere, calling him Papa and asking a million questions about everything. Franklin taught him about horses and cattle, about fixing fences and reading the weather. He told him stories about his brave mother and his father Thomas, making sure the boy knew where he came from. In 1887, another son arrived, and they named him Henry after Franklin's father. The ranch prospered under Franklin's careful management and Grace's tireless work. They added more cattle, bought better horses, and built a real house to replace the expanded cabin. It had a wraparound porch where Grace liked to sit on summer evenings, watching the children play in the yard. Franklin's parents visited often, delighting in their grandchildren. Martha taught Grace her recipes and sewing techniques. Henry and Franklin worked together on bigger projects, the bond between father and son deepening. The homestead became a gathering place for family and neighbors, known for Grace's cooking and Franklin's generosity. In 1890, Grace gave birth to twins, another boy and girl they named Samuel and Rose. Franklin joked that they were building their own ranch crew, but his eyes glowed with pride every time he looked at his growing family. Thomas, now 7, was a serious and helpful older brother. Florence was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity. Little Henry toddled around getting into everything, Life was not always easy. There were harsh winters that killed cattle, dry summers that withered crops, illnesses that scared them half to death. There were disagreements and hard times, moments of doubt and frustration. But through it all, Franklin and Grace faced everything together, their love deepening with each challenge overcome. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1894, Franklin surprised Grace with a necklace he had commissioned from a jeweler in Denver. It was a simple gold chain with a small pendant shaped like a flower, with a tiny diamond at its center. It had cost him most of his savings, but he did not care. "I wanted to give you something beautiful," he said as he fastened it around her neck. "Something that shows how much I love you." Grace touched the pendant with tears in her eyes. They were sitting on their porch in the evening, the children finally asleep inside the house. "You give me something beautiful every day," she said. "This life, this family, I never imagined I could be this happy." "I knew the moment I caught Thomas in my hands that my life had changed forever," Franklin said. "I just did not realize how much better it would become." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had ridden past that day?" Grace asked. "If you had not stopped to help." "No," Franklin said firmly. "Because I did stop. I did help. And I found everything I was looking for, even though I did not know I was looking for it." Grace leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains. The land stretched out before them, their land, their legacy for their children. In the distance, they could hear cattle lowing and horses nickering in the barn. Closer, through the window, they could hear the soft breathing of their sleeping children. "I love you, Franklin Pierce," Grace said softly. "I love you too, Grace Pierce," Franklin replied, using her married name with satisfaction. They sat there as the stars came out one by one, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something lasting. The cowboy who had stopped to help a woman in distress. The widow who had trusted a stranger with her life and her child. Together, they had created a family, a home, a future. In 1896, Franklin finally convinced Grace to take a trip to Denver, leaving the older children with his parents and bringing only the twins, now 6. It was Grace's first real trip since coming to Colorado, and Franklin wanted to show her the city. They stayed in a hotel, ate in restaurants, and walked the busy streets hand in hand. Grace was overwhelmed by the noise and crowds, but Franklin loved watching her eyes light up at the new experiences. On their last night in Denver, they attended a theatrical performance. Grace dressed in a new gown Franklin had bought her, her hair done up in the latest style. She looked elegant and beautiful, and Franklin could not take his eyes off her. "What are you staring at?" Grace asked, blushing. "My wife," Franklin said. "I am the luckiest man in Colorado." "In the whole world, you mean?" Grace teased. "Yes," Franklin agreed seriously. "In the whole world." They returned home to find everything running smoothly under the children's care with their grandparents' supervision. Thomas, now 13, had handled several ranch issues with maturity beyond his years. Florence had helped with cooking and cleaning. Even young Henry had done his chores without complaint. "You have built something good here," Franklin's father said as they stood watching the sunset from the porch. "Not just the ranch, but the family. That boy Thomas, he is fine young man. You raised him right." "Grace raised him right," Franklin corrected. "I just followed her lead." "You both did it together," Henry Pierce said. "That is what matters. You are his father in every way that counts." Franklin felt emotion clog his throat. He had never tried to replace Thomas Crawford in the boy's life, but he had loved him fiercely from that first day. Hearing his own father acknowledge that meant the world to him. Thomas overheard the conversation and approached Franklin later that evening. At 13, he was already nearly as tall as Franklin, with his mother's green eyes and his late father's dark hair. He was at that awkward age between boy and man, but there was nothing awkward about the way he looked at Franklin now. "Papa," he said, using the name he had called Franklin since he could talk. "Grandpa Henry was right. You are my father. I know I had another father who died and Ma has told me about him. But you are the one who has been here, the one who taught me everything. The one who made sure I never felt like I did not belong. I just wanted you to know that." Franklin pulled the boy into a hug, not caring that Thomas was getting too old for such displays. "You are my son," he said firmly. "You always have been, from the moment I helped bring you into this world. I love you, Thomas. I am proud of the man you are becoming." When Franklin told Grace about the conversation later that night, she cried happy tears. "He is the best of both his fathers," she said. "Thomas Crawford gave him life and you gave him everything else. Our son is lucky to have had both of you." The turn of the century came with celebrations across the country, and the Pierce Ranch was no exception. They hosted a party for neighbors and friends, with Grace's famous cooking and Franklin's music. He had taught himself guitar over the years, filling the night. The children danced and played, the adults talked and laughed, and Franklin looked around at everything he had built and felt contentment settle into his bones. Thomas was 18 now, tall and strong, working the ranch alongside Franklin as a full partner. He had inherited his mother's intelligence and his adopted father's work ethic. Franklin knew that when the time came, the ranch would be in good hands. Florence was 15, beautiful and spirited, with a dozen young men already interested in courting her. Franklin pretended to be stern about it, but Grace just laughed at his protectiveness. Henry at 13 was quieter than his siblings, more thoughtful, always with his nose in a book when he was not working. Franklin encouraged it, making sure the boy had access to education even out on the ranch. The twins, Samuel and Rose, were 10 now, inseparable and mischievous, keeping everyone on their toes. They were the babies of the family, and everyone doted on them shamelessly. "Can you believe it?" Grace said to Franklin as they watched their children and guests celebrating the new century. 20 years ago, I was a widow giving birth on the side of the trail. Now look at us." 20 years ago, I was a cowboy with no direction," Franklin replied, "just drifting from job to job. Then I found you and suddenly I had everything." "We found each other," Grace corrected. "God or fate or just luck put us in the same place at the same time." "Best luck I ever had," Franklin said, kissing her temple. In 1902, Thomas announced his intention to marry a girl from a neighboring ranch, a sweet young woman named Catherine. Franklin and Grace gave their blessing and hosted a wedding on the ranch that summer. Watching Thomas pledge his life to Catherine, Franklin remembered his own wedding day and the journey that had brought him here. "He is going to be so happy," Grace whispered, clutching Franklin's hand during the ceremony. "He is," Franklin agreed. "Just like we are." Thomas and Catherine built a house on the Pierce Ranch land, planning to work the spread together with Franklin. The ranch was big enough now to support multiple families, and Franklin was pleased to have his oldest son staying close. He knew that some young men left to make their own way, but Thomas had always loved the land. Florence married in 1904, moving to Ouray with her husband, a mining engineer. It was hard for Grace to see her daughter move away, but Franklin reminded her that Ouray was not far, and they would visit often. He was right. Florence came home frequently, and when she announced she was expecting a baby in 1905, Grace practically lived in Ouray helping her daughter. Henry surprised everyone by announcing he wanted to attend college back east. He had a hunger for education that could not be satisfied with books borrowed from the traveling library. Franklin paid for his tuition proudly, even though it meant tightening the ranch budget. Education was important, and if Henry wanted it, Franklin would make sure he got it. The twins grew into young adults, Samuel taking after Franklin's love for horses and Rose developing an unexpected talent for business, managing the ranch finances with skill that impressed everyone. Franklin joked that Rose should have been the one going to business school, not Henry to his literature studies, but Rose insisted she was happiest right where she was. In 1910, Franklin turned 52. His hair was graying at the temples, his hands were rougher from years of hard work, but his body was still strong. Grace was 49, still beautiful in his eyes, her face showing the lines of a life well lived. They had been married for 26 years, and Franklin loved her more with each passing day. They were sitting on the porch one evening, a common occurrence in their lives, when Grace turned to him with a serious expression. "Do you have any regrets?" she asked. Franklin thought about it carefully. "Not a single one," he said honestly. "Everything that happened, every choice I made led me here to you and our family. Why would I regret any of it? I just think sometimes about that day on the trail," Grace said. "How terrified I was. How certain I was that Thomas and I would die out there, and then you appeared like an angel sent from heaven." "I am no angel," Franklin laughed. "Just a man who was in the right place at the right time." "You were exactly what I needed," Grace said. "And you have been exactly what I needed every day since." "You saved me too," Franklin reminded her. "I was drifting before I found you. You gave me purpose, a reason to build something lasting. You gave me a family and a home. I am the one who should be grateful." "We saved each other then," Grace said, smiling. "That seems fair." In 1912, tragedy struck when Franklin's father Henry passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 79. The loss hit Franklin hard. His father had been his hero, the man who taught him integrity and hard work. They buried Henry Pierce on a hillside overlooking the ranch, and Franklin made sure the headstone was carved from the finest granite. Martha Pierce came to live with Franklin and Grace after her husband's death. She was 75 and still spry, but she did not want to live alone on the farm. Grace welcomed her mother-in-law with open arms, and Martha became an integral part of their household, helping with cooking and spending hours playing with her great-grandchildren. Thomas and Catherine now had 3 children, and Florence had 2. The ranch continued to prosper under Franklin's careful management and the help of his children. They weathered droughts and hard winters, economic downturns and changing markets. But the Pierce family stuck together, supporting each other through every challenge. In 1915, Henry returned from college with a degree and a wife, a professor's daughter from Boston. Franklin was pleased to have all his children settled and happy, though he joked that Henry's wife found ranch life quite different from Boston society. But she adapted, and Henry took over managing the business side of the ranch, freeing Franklin to focus on the land and cattle he loved. Franklin was 57 now, and while he could still ride and work a full day, he was slowing down. He had earned it, he figured. He had built something lasting, something that would outlive him. The Pierce Ranch was known throughout Colorado as one of the finest spreads in the region, run by a family that cared about each other and the land. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1914, Franklin and Grace renewed their vows in the same church where they had married. All their children and grandchildren were there, along with friends and neighbors who had been part of their lives for decades. Doc Morrison, now in his 90s, attended with tears in his eyes. "I knew from the start you two were meant to be," he told them after the ceremony. "Seen a lot of marriages in my time, but few as right as yours." That night, as they lay in bed in the house Franklin had built with his own hands, Grace traced the lines on his face with gentle fingers. 30 years, she said wonderingly. It feels like both forever and no time at all. I would do it all again, Franklin said. Every single day exactly the same. Even that first day, Grace asked with a smile. Even being terrified and having no idea what you were doing, especially that first day, Franklin said firmly. That was the day my real life began. They made love slowly, tenderly, with the comfort of long familiarity and deep love. Afterward, Grace fell asleep with her head on Franklin's chest, and he lay awake listening to her breathe, counting his blessings. In 1918, the world was at war overseas, and even isolated ranchers in Colorado felt the impact. Samuel enlisted despite Franklin's objections, determined to serve his country. Those months when Samuel was overseas were the hardest of Franklin's life since that day he delivered Thomas on the trail. Every day he prayed for his son's safe return, and when Samuel finally came home in 1919, whole and healthy if changed by what he had seen, Franklin wept openly. Martha Pierce passed away in 1920 at the age of 83, dying in her sleep as peacefully as her husband had. They buried her next to Henry on the hillside, and Franklin spent hours there talking to his parents, telling them about the ranch and the family, and how much he missed them. In 1921, Franklin suffered a fall from a horse that broke his leg badly. He was 63, and the injury did not heal as quickly as it would have when he was young. For the first time in his life, Franklin was forced to slow down, to let his sons run the ranch while he recovered. It drove him crazy at first, being cooped up in the house, but Grace made it bearable with her patience and care. "You have worked hard your whole life," she told him when he grumbled about being useless. "You have earned the right to rest." "I do not know how to rest," Franklin complained. "Then learn," Grace said with a smile. "You are not getting any younger, Franklin Pierce. None of us are." The leg healed, though Franklin walked with a slight limp afterward. He went back to work on the ranch, but in a diminished capacity. He spent more time training his sons and grandsons, passing on his knowledge and experience. He spent more time on the porch with Grace, watching sunsets and counting stars. In 1925, they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary with a huge party at the ranch. Children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren filled the house. Friends and neighbors came from miles around. Franklin stood at the head of the table and raised his glass. 40 years ago, I was a cowboy who stopped to help a woman in trouble, he said. I had no idea that decision would lead to everything I have now. Grace, you have given me a life beyond my wildest dreams. You have made me a father, a grandfather, a rancher, but most importantly, you have made me happy. Here is to 40 more years. I will take 20 and be grateful, Grace joked, and everyone laughed. They danced that night, Franklin holding Grace as close as he had on their wedding day. His leg ached and his back was stiff, but he did not care. He was dancing with the woman he loved, surrounded by the family they had built together. "I love you," he whispered in her ear. "I love you too," Grace whispered back. "Always and forever." Thomas, now 42 years old, made a speech about his father, Franklin, that night. He talked about the man who had delivered him on the side of a trail, who had married his mother and given them both a home. He talked about the father who had taught him everything he knew about ranching and life and being a good man. "My biological father gave me life," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "But this man, Franklin Pierce, gave me everything else. He raised me as his own, loved me without reservation, and showed me what it means to be a true father. I am who I am because of him." Franklin could not speak through the tears. He just pulled Thomas into a hug, this son of his heart if not his blood, and held on tight. The years continued to pass. Franklin slowed down more, his body finally showing its age. But his mind stayed sharp, and his love for Grace never wavered. They spent their days together, sitting on the porch they had sat on for decades, watching the ranch run without them now. Their sons and daughters had taken over completely, running things with efficiency and care. In 1932, Franklin suffered a heart episode that scared everyone. Doc Morrison had long since passed away, but the new doctor in Montrose said Franklin needed to take it even easier. He was 74 years old and had worked hard his entire life. His heart was tired. Grace nursed him through his recovery with the same fierce determination she had shown in everything else. She made sure he rested, ate properly, and did not overexert himself. Franklin complained but secretly loved having her fuss over him. "You took care of me when I needed it most," Grace reminded him. "Now it is my turn." "That was different," Franklin protested. "You were giving birth. I am just old." "You are not just anything," Grace said firmly. "You are my husband, and I am going to make sure you are around for a long time yet." And she did. With Grace's care and Franklin's stubborn refusal to give up, he recovered. He would never be as strong as he once was, but he could still walk the ranch, still ride a gentle horse, still sit on the porch and watch the sunset. In 1934, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. The party was smaller than the 40th, with fewer guests able to travel, but the house was still full of family. 5 children, 17 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren crowded around, and Franklin looked at all of them with wonder. "We did this," he said to Grace. "We created all of this." "We did," Grace agreed, her eyes shining. "Not bad for a scared widow and a cowboy who did not know what he was doing." "I knew enough," Franklin said with a smile. "I knew to stop and help. I knew to fall in love with you. I knew to build a life worth living. Everything else, I figured out as I went along." On a cool September evening in 1936, Franklin and Grace sat on their porch watching the sunset, just as they had done thousands of times before. Franklin was 78, Grace was 75, and they were surrounded by the evidence of their life together. The ranch stretched out before them, prosperous and well-run. Their children lived nearby or visited often. Their grandchildren were growing up strong and capable. Their legacy was secure. "You remember that day on the trail?" Grace asked softly. 53 years ago now, does it feel real anymore?" "More real than anything," Franklin said. "I can still see your face, hear your voice. I can still feel Thomas's tiny body in my hands." "That day changed everything." "I was so scared," Grace admitted. "And then you appeared, and somehow I knew it would be all right. I do not know how I knew, but I did." "We were meant to find each other," Franklin said simply. "Some things are just meant to be." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and red. Franklin held Grace's hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm the way he had for over 50 years. His heart was full to bursting with love and gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" Grace asked. "For saying yes when I asked to court you, for marrying me, for building this life with me, for loving me, for everything." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for stopping that day, for helping me, for staying, for loving Thomas as your own. For giving me more children and a home and a life I never imagined possible. For everything." They watched the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky, and the stars began to appear one by one. Somewhere in the house, they could hear the sounds of their family, grandchildren laughing, children talking, the comfortable noise of people who loved each other. Franklin Pierce died peacefully in his sleep 3 months later, in December of 1936, at the age of 78. He went to bed next to Grace as he had every night for 52 years, kissed her good night, told her he loved her, and simply did not wake up. The doctor said his heart had finally given out, worn down by decades of hard work and long life. Grace was devastated but not surprised. She had known his time was coming, had seen him growing weaker despite his protests. She took comfort in knowing he had died peacefully in his own bed in the house he had built, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived. They buried Franklin Pierce on the hillside next to his parents, overlooking the ranch he had built from nothing. All 5 of his children were there, along with countless grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Thomas gave the eulogy, speaking of the father who had caught him as he entered the world and shaped him into the man he became. Grace lived another 7 years, staying in the house on the ranch, cared for by her children. She never remarried, never even considered it. Franklin had been the love of her life, and she was content to wait until she could see him again. She spent her days with her family, telling stories about their grandfather to the younger generation, making sure they knew the legacy they came from. She told them about the day her water broke miles from the nearest doctor, about the young cowboy who stopped to help despite having no idea what he was doing. She told them about how he talked her through the scariest moment of her life, how he caught baby Thomas in his capable hands, how he stayed by her side and never left. She told them about falling in love and building a ranch and creating a family from nothing but hard work and devotion. Grace Crawford Pierce died in her sleep in the spring of 1943 at the age of 82. They buried her next to Franklin on the hillside, and at the funeral, Thomas, now 60 years old, stood looking at his parents' graves side by side. They had a great love, his own son said, standing beside him. The greatest, Thomas agreed. It all started because a cowboy stopped to help my mother when she needed it most, and from that one act of kindness, all of this was built. He gestured to the ranch spread out below them, to the family gathered to pay their respects, to the legacy that would continue for generations. The Pierce Ranch still stands today, run by descendants of Franklin and Grace, a testament to the love story that began on a dusty trail in September of 1883, when a frightened widow's water broke miles from the nearest doctor, and a cowboy talked her through it until help arrived, never imagining that help would turn into forever.